All right, Denise, you all set?
Ready to go.
Great. Thank you all for joining us today to chat about the topic of disruption that happens on the Amazon channel when you as a brand start dealing with Amazon. How does that work? How do you minimize the disruption and all that kind of good stuff? So my name is James Thompson. I'm joined today by Denise Muda. Let me just flip forward here. Denise, did you want to introduce yourself, please?
Sure. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. As James mentioned, I'm Denise Muda. I work for Vorys eControl, and I'm the channel management expert here at the firm. And I help to advise clients on a number of channel management issues as it relates to online marketplace sales. I do have a practitioner as a background, or have a background as a practitioner at a technology organization who also made the foray into Amazon selling, where we hadn't previously done so, and had to wrangle with a lot of the issues that we are going to be covering today. So I'll be covering them from both angles.
Great. And I'm James Thompson. I work for a company called Buybox Experts. I had the opportunity to work at Amazon for a number of years on the third-party side and got to see firsthand what happens to brands when they have to make this adjustment to starting to sell on Amazon versus having other retailers sell their products on Amazon, whether those are authorized or unauthorized sellers. I've actually co-authored a book with one of Denise's colleagues on this issue of controlling your brand in the age of Amazon. I'll talk about that a little bit later. But this issue of how do brands deal with Amazon in a situation where, you know, as a new channel for brands, the impact of Amazon can be rather substantial to the overall channel management strategy of the brand. And so as we think about what does it mean for a brand to become more active with the Amazon channel, there are a number of operational, financial issues that come into play that we're going to cover today in our discussion, and we'll take it from here. So let's start, Denise, with this big question of I'm a brand. I've decided I'm going to be active with the Amazon channel. How do I think about the Amazon channel if quite frankly, I've got existing relationships with distributors and retailers? I don't want to upset them, but I also want to do what's best for my brand on the Amazon channel. Where do we go from here?
Yeah, I think, it's a great question, and that's something that as a practitioner and as I work with clients here at eControl that I had to, and many brands have to wrestle with. And the question is, can you do it without disrupting your current brick and mortar retailers and distributors? And I would break that down into two pieces. First and foremost, I will say, you're going to disrupt your channel, but it really depends on who you're talking about and how disruption is viewed. So the folks that can be impacted are those selling on brick and mortar in a brick and mortar manner that are already selling on Amazon, those distributors that might be selling to resellers who sell on Amazon themselves, retailers or distributors that are diverting products, like all sorts of different ways in which those folks may be operating on the platform today. And, I think, there's concern relative to whether or not that brand will hurt the retailer's existing brick and mortar sales by making a foray into selling on Amazon and other marketplaces. So there's lots of considerations that have to be taken under consideration in order to determine where you fall on that spectrum as it relates to the disruption that may end up taking place in your channels.
Let's just spend a moment. Disruption, what are we talking about? I'm thinking there's potentially sales being diverted to the Amazon channel. There's potentially issues with different prices on different channels. What other kinds of things do you encapsulate within this concept of disruption?
I think there's disruption to the brand itself. I think there's disruption to, the channel at large. And so from a brand standpoint, there are a number of brands that I have spoken with, and as a practitioner myself, you just don't even realize the amount of activity that's taking place on Amazon that is in fact disrupting your current channels of distribution who may not be operating there and that are very important to you. So there is a lot of price erosion that can come from that play off of different channels of distribution. There's also disruption that happens to you as a brand. So because of the wide open nature of Amazon, as you well know, there are a number of entities that can be selling a brand's products that just aren't held to the same quality control standards, who aren't caring for those products in the way in which that you would like your brand to be cared for. And so the consumer experience can be impacted, and that manifests itself by way of bad reviews and all of those things that are really, really transparent to consumers. It create a lot of confusion in their mind as to whether or not the brand has a handle on their brand.
Many years ago, I used to run the business of recruiting on sellers to the Amazon channel. Whether they're authorized or unauthorized doesn't make any difference to Amazon. And yet, if someone could show up with product and sell it, Amazon's quite happy to have them on the channel, because the more sellers there are selling the same items, the more price competition there is. But also, the crazier things get with regards to who's submitting brand content on those listings and who's representing your brand on this channel. It doesn't necessarily have to be an authorized seller. And quite frankly, the disruption that we think of around pricing, there's also big disruption around the consistency of messages that customers on Amazon may be seeing when they look at your brand's materials on Amazon versus what you might be spending millions of dollars and lots of people on your team focused on creating a consistent brand in all of your other so-called authorized channels. So lots of opportunity for disruption on multiple levels. As I think of what brands are doing today, certainly 2010, 2015, still a number of brands that said, Amazon is a small enough channel, I don't have to worry about it because it doesn't represent a lot of sales dollars. That certainly misrepresentations there around, number one, actual sales going through this channel versus perceived level of sales. But this issue also, again, of consistent branding, you may have a number of people who are being first exposed to your brand on Amazon, and they're seeing whatever shoddy documentation of images and content that an unauthorized seller might be putting on this channel that creates a problem for your brand when the customer might then see your brand in another channel. And so as we think of all these different forms of disruption, the good news is a brand can address all these issues, but it takes proactivity on their part, and also typically a change in the way they think about this Amazon channel. It's not about whether you as a brand are thinking, I am now ready to enter this market, versus my brand has already entered this market potentially through a back door. I need to make sure that I control what my brand looks like on this channel, and hence what the implications are going to be to my other established channels who have high transparency to what's going on Amazon and can understandably get frustrated.
Yeah, it's definitely a common scenario for the brands I work with. And as you well know, since we work with each other,
yes,
way back from the beginning when I was a practitioner, it was a bigger mess than I had ever assumed it was, because to your example, I just hadn't been paying attention.
So to take us through, desired and actual situation here, so that we're talking the same language.
Sure. So I think at the end of the day, any brand wants clean channels. They want their product available to consumers in the way in which they want to buy them, and that can vary. As noted here, in some cases, you have consumers who want to touch and feel the product, so they're willing to travel to a store and touch and feel that product before they buy it. They may like the convenience of online shopping, and so therefore they go through those channels, and you want those decisions to be made in a value-added manner. And what I mean by that is I want my shopping experience to be tailored to the way in which I want to shop. And so I'm going to pick those channels based on that, not necessarily because in one channel, for some reason it's significantly lower priced. And as a result of that, I might get lower quality maybe depending on that. So I just really want parity as a brand.
Right.
And I want the shopping experience to be reflective of the brand experience that I want to convey. And
So
so,
going back to this concept of you, the brand, may not have set up this Amazon channel. It's already there. I'm just flipping ahead to the next situation. You may wake up one day to discover my brand is on Amazon. And oh, by the way, as you talked about with this price erosion, I don't know who these people are selling the products. Unauthorized sellers can include an awful lot of different groups of people. They can be authorized retailers who have decided to set up shop under a different company name over here on Amazon, or it may just straight up be product diversion happening, products being sold to people who you've never heard of, you have no active direct or indirect relationship with, and yet they're the ones representing your brand on this channel.
That's right. That's right. And it's not just a price issue, it's a quality issue. So, my direct experience, as well as those of other clients that we service, you're shocked to see sort of this dynamic happening. And oftentimes the first time you hear about it is from your brick and mortar channels. What is going on over here? Yep. And in those cases where you're not paying attention, once you start to uncover that, you experience just exactly what you mentioned. Not only is it, how are they able to sell it so inexpensively? And how does that impact the way in which they're investing in the brand? And oftentimes what we find is that they're not. And to your point, it's just resulting in very shoddy listings. It's very unclear to the client what they're buying. They buy it, they return it, they express poor experiences, and it just becomes a real, brand issue for the manufacturer that they have to manage.
Right. Okay, so now the question is, you've shown me as a brand that I need to be more proactive with the Amazon channel, whether that means I, as a seller, am going to sell direct, or I'm going to work with authorized resellers to represent my brand in this channel. The question then becomes, how do I do this without disrupting the existing relationships that I have with brick and mortar channels and other traditional distributor models?
Yeah, I think the fact is that just by the mere fact that e-commerce is here and it's disrupted the market, you start to have to make choices about your brand that are going to result in change for certain portions of your channel, and change is always disruptive. However, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's equally disruptive to all four corners of your channel ecosystem. So there are some channels that are very, very thankful, very, very happy when a brand decides that they're going to take control,
right,
and really create some order for the brand, and that will be reflected very well through certain channels of distribution who are very happy for that control.
So who's not going to be happy when you finally button things up?
The ones that aren't going to be happy are the ones that are on Amazon today, or who are supplying sellers that are on Amazon. We traditionally find that retailers and distributors that have no interest in operating on Amazon for the most part, and understand or can be convinced of the fact that getting control is actually better for the entire ecosystem at the end of the day, they're very much on board with it. But if we happen to, and oftentimes we don't, but if we happen to find distributors and retailers that are selling there today, or represent sellers who are, the volumes aren't as big as they think they are, but there's an emotional component to that discussion that data has to dispel.
Right. Okay, so let's look then. One of the models that our company's put together is, what are the different components of decision making that needs to go into figuring out as a brand how to put a proper Amazon channel strategy together. And we have a framework here where, think of this as a three-legged stool where all three legs on the stool need to be in place. If you only do two or one of the legs, the whole thing falls over. And let's talk about what each of these three are. And we're going to talk extensively here for the next few minutes about each component of these. But in summary, channel governance is primarily the whole concept of, do you as a brand have a clear sense as to who's going to represent your brand on Amazon? That may be representing it from a branding perspective, representing it from a sales perspective, representing it from an advertising perspective. But how are you as a brand making sure that you have proper control over those agents that are representing you? You may, in fact, choose to go direct to consumer and be the seller of record. You may designate someone else to manage your branding. You may designate someone else to do your advertising. But at the end of the day, the people that are representing you are people that you can have conversations with, and you're in a position to go in more of a partnership mode and be able to work together to make sure that your brand continues to be properly represented on this channel. The second part of this three-legged stool has to do with the branding and what kind of content do you put into the catalog. If we start with a very basic assumption that chances are somebody will find a way to get their hands on product on your brand, get some inventory, even if it's a couple units here or there, somebody will find a way to get some units and they will put them on Amazon. And if you put a product on Amazon, you need content. You need a product listing. And that product listing is going to have images. It's going to have bullet points and product descriptions. And quite frankly, if I'm not the brand, who's to say I'm going to do a particularly good job of representing the brand? It turns out Amazon has programs in place where brands can submit content in an authoritative manner, where Amazon will acknowledge that that content is the content that should be shown to represent the brand. And as a result, you can separate out this issue of, do you manage your branding and do you manage your distribution? Even if distribution and managing who's going to represent you, even if that continues to be a problem, at a minimum, you can know that consumers who see your brand on the channel are seeing content that's consistent and accurate and complete with everything else that you're doing in other channels. So that concept of optimizing the catalog and saying, as a brand, I will be proactive in making sure that my content is in fact accurate with what I want it to be, that's a very, very important step for brands to take, and one that acknowledges that nobody cares about the brand as much as the brand. And then the third leg of the stool has to do with essentially driving traffic to the listing. So if you decide to use Amazon as a channel where you or authorized resellers are going to sell product, what are you doing to invest in creating traffic? You may have traffic that you can bring by way of email or other forms of external traffic, but for most brands, growth on Amazon comes by way of doing advertising. I'm not interested in investing $1 in advertising if it's going to drive traffic to a listing that's not properly optimized and hence won't convert very well, or to a listing where the seller of record is some unauthorized seller who, in fact, by investing in advertising, I'm creating the wrong incentive. I'm creating more incentive for more people who I don't control to show up and get sales from my product. So if I have the right kind of people representing me that I can communicate with, if I have proper catalog content that's properly optimized for Amazon organic search and conversion, and I'm investing in advertising in order to make sure that I drive traffic to my listings, that model can work extremely well to make sure that your brand at least has a realistic chance of succeeding without doing harm to your branding, and doing it in a way where there's more likelihood that you're going to have consistent pricing across channels and not be in a situation where things are always cheaper on the Amazon channel. So let's start with channel governance. Denise, this is your neck of the woods. Tell us more about some of these particular issues.
Sure. So I think you've alluded to it here, and you speak about it extensively in terms of your experience at Amazon. I mean, this is an open marketplace, and they are in the business of recruiting as sort of many sellers as they possibly can that have inventory. And so as a result of that dynamic and the fact that there's a incentive and a propensity for so many different sellers to be on this channel, which at the end of the day really only requires one to be there to service your products, and can create sort of a lot of issues as it relates to over distribution. And over distribution always leaves a brand in a situation in which there isn't a lot of incentive for those sellers to invest in the brand,
Right.
because to your earlier point, why would I do that when there's a chance for someone else to actually benefit from that, especially as it relates to quality and from a price standpoint. So because Amazon is that open marketplace, it really can create an over distribution issue that you have to get your arms around.
Amazon wants the more the merrier, because the more the merrier creates typically price competition, which drives down prices, which is good for Amazon customers and is horrible for brands. So clearly a misalignment of incentives there between what's best for Amazon and what's best for you, your brand.
Right.
If you're not paying attention to what happens on Amazon, then you'll end up with a whole pile of companies selling. We had a client at one point, they had 140 unauthorized sellers selling their products, and they didn't know who any of these people were. And the crazy thing is, even if they did know who these sellers were, there are federal laws that protect many of these brands, protect many of these sellers from being able to continue to sell these products unless the brand takes certain steps, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. So if you've got the Wild West happening on Amazon and you as a brand are continuing to bury your head in the sand and just say, I'm not going to worry about it because it doesn't represent a lot of sales. If you've noticed what's happened in the last 6 months, Amazon continues to grow and grow very aggressively, and consumers are doing their shopping there. More than half of all product search online starts on Amazon. And if lo and behold, someone finds your brand, finds your brand's product listings on Amazon and it's ugly, that's going to reflect very badly on your product. So let's keep going on channel governance here. Tell me, what's Amazon going to do to help me manage my distribution and make sure that I only have authorized sellers on the channel?
They won't help you with that at all. That's not what they're incented to do. So what we've been told by others who've worked with Amazon is Amazon will tell them, it's not our job to, drive clean channels and get your channels under control. That's your job to do that. So don't expect that they will assist you in that regard.
Yep.
Price erosion on, Amazon. What we find often, and this as well, particularly, for example, if you have a first party relationship with Amazon, that algorithm is going to react and be very sensitive to price erosion on, the Amazon marketplace. And so, while their goal is to drive down prices in an effort to, continue to keep consumers preferring them as a platform, that can create a significant amount of price pressure, not just on the platform, but as it relates to brick and mortar channels as well. So this is a channel ecosystem, channel management, and frankly, an issue in getting your channels to invest in your brand. We've heard time and time again, even brick and mortar channels who have had a lot of pressure from the Amazon marketplace say, hey, look, unless you can get this under control, it's really becoming not in our best interest to continue to invest in your brand. So, and that's something that's very alarming for a brand to hear. You want to make sure that there's, good enough profit for your entire channel ecosystem to want to continue to invest in building your brand and supporting the consumers that they're bringing your brand to.
Very important point you raised here. When you think about this open marketplace where all these products are being sold by all these different sellers, and we're talking, there's north of 5 million sellers now on Amazon. It's also important to keep in mind that you may be a large, well-established national brand, but there are literally millions of private label, digitally native brands that are also finding their way onto Amazon. And many of these companies know how to play the game a whole lot better than some of the big national brands that haven't really invested adequately to control what's happening on the Amazon channel. So if you have a bunch of product listings on Amazon that look like they're not properly optimized for content, and there's clearly a bunch of unnecessary price erosion happening, that creates a lot of noise. And then you take a digitally native brand that people may not have heard of, but know how to play the Amazon game, have high quality content, don't have a bunch of unauthorized sellers. They're able to create a very clean look and feel for consumers. Turns out Amazon's a transactional marketplace. And so most product search on Amazon is unbranded, which results in consumers trying a lot of brands that aren't necessarily well known to them. And yet those brands are garnering share and stealing share from big national brands that are used to being able to essentially buy shelf space and expect that they're going to generate certain levels of sales. So take a national brand that isn't paying attention to the Amazon channel, they're going to have price erosion, but they're also going to have a situation where, I don't want to say entitlement, but they kind of expect, well, aren't we going to have some type of similar market share? that's just not the way the Amazon channel happens. And you can have your lunch eaten by a bunch of small digitally native brands because you're not really paying attention.
Yeah, it's a category issue at that point. So it's not just an intra-brand competition thing, but you lose out, you know, as it relates to your, you know, who should be your true competitors within the category you're trying to be successful in.
Yep.
Yeah, sorry, I just want to move my screen here. MAP policy versus online reseller policy. Those are two distinctly different things. So from a MAP standpoint, the challenge when it comes to gray market unauthorized sales is that you have no way to effectuate a MAP policy relative to those gray market sellers. And so what ends up happening when you have a MAP policy in place with your authorized channels is that they'll come back to you and say, well, look, you're asking me to adhere to your MAP policy, minimum advertised price policy,
Right.
but what about all these other guys? And you know, you're basically negatively impacting your authorized channels at the expense of the gray marketers that have no, you know, tie to a MAP policy whatsoever because you just have no way to effectuate it.
And the buy box algorithm on Amazon favors lower prices. So
That's right.
unauthorized sellers who aren't bound by the same terms of a MAP policy, they're more likely to get more of the sales opportunity because Amazon's pushing them into the buy box, which is the algorithm. You know, that's the algorithm that when you click the add to cart button, Amazon has pre-selected a seller. So if they're pre-selecting lower priced unauthorized sellers to get the sale, yeah, that's pretty ugly. Thanks for holding me to a MAP policy when I have no chance of actually getting a sale.
That's right. That's right. And, you know, whether you're on the platform or off. So it impacts like sort of, you know, all points of the channel ecosystem. And online reseller policy, you know, especially one that's sort of developed and implemented from an eControl standpoint can provide you with a legal foundation that's necessary to be able to take control of the channel on Amazon so that and other marketplaces, frankly. So, you know, we really consider an online reseller policy to be the true good foundation for effectuating sales control. Yep. And then MAP can be then leveraged from there as a tool on top of that. But we do not see them as interchangeable and not sort of a true choice between the two at an equal level.
So MAP policy is great if all I have is authorized resellers, but the right. moment you add a single unauthorized seller, a MAP policy becomes not an effective tool for handling something
That's
like the
exactly
Amazon
right.
channel. Okay, so let's keep going here and talk about how do I solve some of these issues.
That's right. So it's not a policy versus enforcement trade-off. It's really a policy and enforcement. So as I mentioned previously, you know, we have an eControl solution that's rooted in developing a set of policies that, you know, set expectations around quality controls, and set expectations around material differences that allow brands to overcome the first sale doctrine, which is, you know, sort of a U.S. law that protects a lot of the gray market selling that's taken place so far on Amazon. So you really need that legal foundation on the front end, which then gives you the basis for enforcement relative to not only unauthorized gray market sellers, but also those channels that may be operating there that you consider in general authorized, but you have not authorized to sell on marketplaces.
So the good news is there is a way to fix all this distribution noise. The bad news, and certainly something I'd like everyone to take away from this discussion, is now that there are online marketplaces that welcome everybody and anybody to sell, as a brand, you now have a new cost of doing business. And that cost of doing business is the ongoing enforcement. You can't just say, hey, I'm going to hire a lawyer and I'm going to build a policy and I'm going to roll it out and I'm done. Actually, forever going forward, there will be a need to make sure that you're enforcing that policy, to make sure that new sellers don't show up and mess up the whole party. And you know, for some of the clients that we've worked with, they say, wait a minute, it's going to cost me tens of thousands of dollars to clean up this mess, and I got to keep paying that every year? And the answer is yeah, because unfortunately, online marketplaces are continue to continue to be open. At least some of them, like Amazon, will continue to be open, which creates this challenge as a brand. As a brand, your first mistake is your brand is popular. if your brand wasn't popular, nobody would go looking for it. But the fact is, it's popular enough that people are interested, consumers are interested in buying it, which means somebody's interested in getting product to sell and try to make a buck on those sales. And so you've got to continue to do the enforcement long after you happen to have a policy in place.
Yeah, and I think there's a couple of ways just to add to that, that enforcement, or I guess you can more, you can broaden it to marketplace cleanup. It is, there are some brands we work with who are really, really eager to try to figure out the root cause of where that gray market leakage is coming from. And they do have channels of distribution that are willing to work with them, you know, on that. And what I mean by that is, you know, there, many distributors do understand that having a healthy marketplace and channel control impacts them just as positively as a retailer might see that. And so they're willing to participate in working with the brands to try to plug the holes, if you will, and,
Right.
and shore off those leaks that are really propagating the inventory sources to those unauthorized sellers. So we do have some clients who we're able to work with on that as well.
So I want to clean up my channel. Tell me a little bit about how do I think about this issue of, I think you used the term over distribution. I've got 10 authorized retailers today. Do I let them all sell on Amazon?
Yeah, we don't recommend that.
Mm-hmm.
Amazon's what we call more of a vertical channel, and I characterize it as an online shopping mall. And if I'm a consumer going to Amazon, there's really one front door to that shopping mall, and I really only need one seller that's really good servicing me through that channel. I think you've used the analogy that you can't be married to 10 people at once. It becomes really, really complicated in terms of trying to keep them all happy. And we liken having multiple sellers on Amazon like having, you know, 20 Toyota dealerships on one city block.
Yes.
At the end of the day, you know, the only way to compete in that environment is either to come up with some really wild value-added differentiation, which is not easy to do on Amazon because you
Right.
are hooking into that brand listing.
Right.
So the only differentiation you have is price. And so the only way that you're going to be fighting for that business is to try to win that buy box, and you're going to be lowering your price. And once that price is lowered in that intense competition, you are not going to have these sellers that are investing in your brand. And so quality is going to go down, and at the end of the day, the consumer is going to get the short end of that stick. And so really honing in and ensuring that you've got one quality seller that knows what they're doing. I think that's the other key piece of this. You would not take a native online seller and give them permission to go, you know, open a storefront under your brand name, a brick and mortar storefront. They wouldn't know what they're doing. I don't know, planograms and, you know, whatever, building leases and whatever else goes into all that, just as you wouldn't expect a brick and mortar retailer to be native to Amazon and understand all of the complicated nuances associated with that. So you want to mitigate over distribution, one, and you want to pick the right seller for the job that knows what they're doing and is going to be in this with you from a brand standpoint. It really help you to build your presence on that platform in the category. Like,
Right.
Get rid of the intra-brand competition and focus on inter-brand competition, because that's really where you win.
With all these other brands, I mean, unless you've got a highly unusual product, your biggest issue on Amazon is the 5,000 other competitor brands that are competing to get the sale. And so if you can't get your own house in order with the right kind of company that understands the Amazon sandbox, if you don't get that organized and have the right content and the right, you know, price consistency, you're going to lose out to the thousands of other brands that also have shown up to try to grab the same customers.
That's right.
Okay, and then finally, how do I think about this issue of cost? I want to control governance, but I also am in a situation where it's going to cost me money to do this enforcement. It's going to cost me some very awkward conversations with some of my well-established brick and mortar retailers who are saying, wait a minute, I want to be the guy that you pick to sell your products on Amazon. How do you think about, you know, internal and external costs?
Yeah, I think there's sort of hard and soft costs, and I think you've hit on, you know, some of those already. From an internal standpoint, definitely you're going to want to get that foundation in place, and there's going to be an upfront cost associated with that and ongoing enforcement, or what we call that root cause, trying to just shore up the leaks associated with inventory supply to unauthorized sellers. In my experience and in the experience of brands that I deal with, if you don't already have somebody in place who, maybe you do decide to continue to have a MAP policy, and you have a MAP sort of coordinator or somebody who's responsible for enforcement and governance of that. In my experience, we leverage that same role to do some of the enforcement work hand in hand with the eControl team. And so
Yes.
if you don't have that already, you may have to bring that up on board. But as it relates to some of those internal costs, you'll have to be prepared for that. If you don't know what you're doing on Amazon, like I didn't know what I was doing on Amazon, you're going to want to hire an expert that knows what they're doing. Now, it may be your existing channels of distribution, someone there who you're convinced that they know what they're doing, or they might pick, a buy box experts to help them, have their own third-party presence on the marketplace. And trading off whether or not you want to build that internal competency versus you want to pay somebody to do that. Being a true channel person, I will hire the expert that knows what they're doing in the space that I'm trying to expand. So yeah, I'm not I'm not in favor of building that competency internally. But those are some of the factors that you have to think through. And then some of the soft, costs associated with this are really the change management that's going to happen internally within your own organization, because oftentimes the brick and mortar sales team, if they aren't educated about how this is beneficial for the entire channel ecosystem, you have to spend the time bringing them up to speed and demonstrating why that's the case. The good news is so many brands have put this type of structure in place. Oftentimes some of these big brick and mortar retailers, like they know this is not new news to them in terms of what needs to happen. And then those, softer costs associated with having to negotiate with channels that might be on Amazon today and sort of express to them that they're not authorized to sell there anymore. And going through those conversations and having to weigh sort of your power as a brand relative to that particular channel's power to, relative to your business. And is that a hard cutoff? Is it a phased approach? Like, how do you manage through that change externally? Those are some of the soft costs that are associated with that.
The bad news is it could take hours for us to go through any of these in detail. I'm realizing we've got about 20 minutes left, so I'm going to keep moving through the slides. Happy to have conversations with anybody here who's joined us today. We can dig a lot deeper into any of these particular topics. The nuances of how do you actually roll out these policies? How do you actually enforce these policies? There's an art and a science to that, and we can certainly talk further as it relates to any individual brand's situation. So let's, I want to talk about some of the case study situations, Denise, that you've been through as both an employee of a brand as well as a consultant advising brands. Talk to me what happens when a distributor says, to heck with you, Mr. Brand, I don't like this, what you're doing.
Mm-hmm. So oftentimes what we experience in that case is less that the distributor is trying to sell on Amazon. There's some cases for that, but oftentimes those are smaller distributors, and then you're there's a different calculus that goes into that. Oftentimes though, what we find are basically the way the policy structure works that Vorys eControl puts into place, or basically we have a policy direct with that distributor, and then the request is that those distributors pass reseller policies on through to those channels that are buying from them. And they may say, you know what, it's a lot of work for me, or maybe they know that they're supplying gray market sellers on the marketplace, and so they don't want to do that. At the end of the day, we can enforce without distributor participation in those cases. And to your point, then, if you don't have the strength to sort of overcome that, enforcement may be a longer game for you as a brand. But the other piece of that as well is if the distributor doesn't want to participate with the brand, I often spend time with brands talking through, well, what are the incentives that you have in place with your distributors? Oftentimes we find that they're very liberal. So from an upfront wholesale price standpoint, or depending on how, each industry calls that pricing something different, I'll call it wholesale pricing for now. you have very liberal wholesale pricing, and on top of that, you have a bunch of incentives, and you're really providing them with the margin room, or you're incenting them to consume more inventory than their natural demand, will support. They're going to find ways to rid themselves of that inventory. And so tightening up some of those incentives just to prevent leakage, or putting mechanisms in place over time that provide, maybe more of a stick relative to that behavior versus a carrot, and trying to leverage those incentives and those pricing structures to tighten up the ability for those distributors to behave in a way you don't want them to. So there's a couple of ways to go about that.
So next issue, you may have a retailer or a reseller who set up shop a long time ago on Amazon, long before you decided as a brand that it's time to smarten up your channel management strategy.
Mm-hmm.
How do you tell an existing retailer that may not be doing a particularly good job representing your brand on Amazon? How do you tell them, we're going to replace you?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I always start with data, because oftentimes brands will think, and the retailer as well, will think it's a bigger deal than it actually is. They might tell you they're getting a lot of sales. You don't have the data at your fingertips to dispute that. And once you get that data, you find that there is not a lot of revenue at risk there for either party. Then it becomes a little bit of an emotional conversation. And then you have to pivot that conversation to, look, and typically the pricing data will bear this out. Look, at the end of the day, we've seen our ASPs decline over time. This happens a lot. We've looked at trend data. This not only impacts us, but it impacts you as well. And so in order for us to create a cleaner channel ecosystem where we can both be successful, and the fact is you're not as successful within the category as you think you are, there's a lot of upside opportunity that we can go after here, like the brand can go after. There's also positive effects. If, for example, you've got a consumer that bought something online, maybe the retailer, in this instance, a reseller, hasn't benefited from it. If that consumer is within their brick and mortar storefront, they're going to have some affinity to that brand. And so they'll be more than likely to buy it within that, retail space, because consumers go back and forth. They're not necessarily exclusive to one or the other. There's a couple of ways to do that.
Somewhat related to the first situation, you may also have a situation where it's not difficult for you and the retailer, or you and the distributor, to come eye to eye to realize that there's somebody has to be supplying these unauthorized sellers. It doesn't just magically appear. And so having that hard conversation, saying your job is not to be selling in this channel or selling to people who sell in this channel. As you say, somebody may lose money, at least short term, as a result of having to clamp down on tightening up your distribution channels. But in the long run, you as a brand, your primary job is to do what's best to protect the long-term equity of your brand. And that may mean having to say no to companies you've dealt with. It may mean having to say no to companies you've dealt with for a long time. But if you don't have proper alignment of incentives, then you're going to be in a situation where, yes, somebody loses, somebody wins, but I sure as heck hope as a brand that I win, because I've got to be in a position where my brand is still relevant 5 years from now. If I don't start cleaning this stuff up, it's not going to take long before that price just keeps dropping further and further and further. And all the money I spend on marketing and brand building outside of Amazon is going to go for naught as the price on Amazon continues to fall further and further. Nobody
cares about your brand as much as you do, period.
Yep. So I'm going to quickly talk through a few things here. When we talk about the second leg of the stool around your optimized catalog and your branding, you want to have consistent messages on Amazon with consistent with other channels. You want to be in a situation where you're using some of these tools that Amazon makes available to lock down content as a brand. I talked about that earlier. The program's called the Brand Registry. But you as a brand can then designate an authorized seller and say, hey, Mr. Authorized Reseller, you're going to be the one that's actually going to submit content on our behalf. There's ways of not having to jump completely into Amazon's tools and have to learn how those tools work inside. No, you can designate the controls of driving your car. You can turn that over to somebody else, but at least someone is controlling it. with whom you've got direct communication. There are a bunch of interesting things that happen on Amazon where you may have sellers that are creating different types of bundles that you don't even offer in other channels. Interesting that you can learn what consumer preferences may be moving towards just by looking at some of those bundles. And so if you've got an authorized seller, working with that person to use Amazon as a testing ground for looking at ways that you might be able to create multi-packs or variety packs or new flavors or sizes of products that you don't otherwise make available elsewhere, you can learn an awful lot from Amazon rather than having to do long, drawn-out focus groups and market launches and all this kind of stuff. Amazon's a pretty cool place to test things out and gather data very, very quickly. As you think about your catalog on Amazon, it's very easy for multiple people to create listings for exactly the same product. That creates nothing but customer confusion on Amazon, where there's 5 pairs of the same running shoe. What's the difference between these different listings? I don't know. As a consumer, you're more likely to move on to some other brand and say, I want to be able to understand exactly what I'm getting. And so part of the challenge of keeping up with Amazon is duplicate listings can show up at any time. Somebody's got to be actively managing your catalog, not just now, but as part of the ongoing Amazon channel management, someone's got to be looking at that at all times. And then the other peculiarity I want to mention here is Amazon's catalog model is based on unique UPCs. There are a lot of ways to put bogus UPCs into the Amazon catalog. And so if you're an unauthorized seller, you can go and buy UPCs of your own and represent a brand's products using these bogus UPCs. That creates a whole bunch of messiness that somebody has to go and actively manage. As a brand, it's best to be using your actual UPCs to make sure that you've got consistency, not just within Amazon, but across different online channels. If I happen to type in a UPC, I want to be able to see your product and your product only. I don't want to have other products mixed in. And so this continues to be part of that ongoing catalog management that's required to be more proactive with the Amazon channel. We only have a few minutes here, so I'm going to run through this part fairly quickly. But basically, as a brand, I want to invest money in driving traffic to authorized sellers who are following the policies that I put in place. I want to make sure that as I spend money on advertising, I'm doing it in a way where I can also gauge our products in stock. If I'm working with authorized resellers, I can make sure that as we have inventory issues, that I don't overspend on products that I don't have in stock. And likewise, if I've got new products that I want to focus more on, that I'm coordinating when advertising is going to be put in place to help drive sales of particular products. To wrap things up here, we've only scratched the surface on some of the details of these specific issues. Earlier this year, Denise's colleague, Whitney Gibson, he and I published a book that you can find on Amazon called Controlling Your Brand in the Age of Amazon, a much more in-depth, extensive playbook of how do you work through some of these issues, how do you have some of these difficult conversations with your existing channels, what's involved in not only doing that initial transition, but the ongoing management around the issues of channel governance, the issues of catalog and branding control, and the issues around advertising and driving traffic to your listings. So thank you for listening. We've got time for a few questions here. One question that came in a little bit earlier, if you're a brand and sell through a third-party distributor on Amazon, Amazon can come after you and block your listing if there's only one authorized seller. Is that correct? Amazon actually doesn't get involved in this whole question of authorized and unauthorized. And so if you do a good job of cleaning up your distribution so you have only one authorized reseller on the channel, Amazon's not going to block your listing. They're just more likely to go out and try to recruit more sellers to come onto the listing. And so Amazon's basically working against you to have only one seller, but they're not going to block your listing. They're just going to try to create more competition on that listing. But the good news is if you've tightened up distribution, it's going to be harder and harder for new unauthorized sellers to find inventory that they can then turn around and sell on the Amazon listing. Anything you wanted to add on this particular question, Denise?
No, I think that covers it.
Comment from one particular person. I worked on the Amazon channel for a premium luggage company. I would explain to brick-and-mortar accounts that selling on Amazon was really a way to protect the brand so we could protect their business, and gave us some control. Denise, anything you wanted to add there in terms of, as you think about protecting your existing brick-and-mortar business, how have you seen brands effectively manage the active aspects of Amazon so as to reinforce and continue to grow the retail business?
Yeah, so for those brands who've been successful in sort of really managing and sort of taking control of their brand, you can immediately see changes in consumer sentiment about the products that are being bought on the Amazon channel. And oftentimes you can see an immediate improvement in average selling prices. And so based on what I expressed earlier about oftentimes we have brands coming to us and saying, look, I'm at, my brick and mortar retailers are complaining. There's a lot of, price erosion on Amazon. It's impacting them. Consumers are coming in and they're asking for us to match those prices. We're going to come back to you and we are going to ask you for special concessions on trade spend. Like, it just becomes this very vicious cycle. And once you turn that around, rising tide sort of lifts all boats, and it becomes a much healthier situation. Not just from a pricing standpoint, but that surely is a benefit of that. But, when consumers are a lot more excited about a brand because they have a great experience online, they're more than likely, especially if it's a consumable product or things like that, and they happen to be in a brick and mortar store, they're going to pick that product up. Great for the brand. And they're not going to be going to the counter and saying, look, I found this, $5 cheaper on Amazon. Can you match it? It just,
right. So even if you're not dealing with consumers challenging you, the amount of special discounting and pricing.
Yes, absolutely.
Those costs may be somewhat hidden to brands today, but when you actually work out how much you're spending as a brand to entice the channel to buy more inventory than they might otherwise want to buy, or for them to sell more inventory than they might otherwise be prepared to spend, there's a lot of kind of perverse incentives that can build up over time, where as a brand, you're leaving a lot of margin, you're spending a lot of money to drive sales that may be unnecessary if in fact you tighten up distribution, you have designated sellers for different channels, and you work to create a consistent consumer experience across those different channels. It's staggering the amount of so-called wasted spend that goes into the channel because you're trying to keep everybody happy, when ultimately there's a fundamental problem where you're not doing a good job of saying no to requests by different channels or by different retailers. It's pretty staggering when you start to rip apart and look at the actual data around the financial cost of doing business as usual.
That's absolutely right. Yeah, I had firsthand experience with that.
We have time for a couple more questions. If anyone on today's call would like to submit a question through the Q&A on the bottom of the screen. Any other stuff that you wanted to mention, Denise, in terms of success stories you've seen where brands have gone from being not particularly well evolved to address online channels to being very sophisticated when it comes to successful sales on an online channel, but also creating that consistency across channels?
Yeah. I'll just speak generally. We do have a number of brands who are able to sort of turn that around, and the conversations that change with their brick and mortar channels, the changes are highly positive. You start having conversations around, investment in building the brand, where previously it was conversations pulling out a laptop and saying, what are you going to do about this? And from a disruption standpoint. The other comment I'll make is that much of what we've been speaking about, especially as it relates to the control piece that Vorys eControl brings to the table, is very focused on the United States. A lot of the principles from a negative standpoint, meaning the challenges that brands face on Amazon and other marketplaces, are definitely resident in other countries. Canada being an example, Europe being an example. Canada is probably a little bit close in terms of the levers you can pull to the US, but Europe is markedly different.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that the options available to you are not there. There's still a way to put a foundation in place and put some semblance of control in place, maybe not as tight as the US, but definitely an opportunity to try to get, you know, some things under control. The one thing I will mention about Europe is if a brand wanted to put a, you know, a price policy in place like MAP, they're not legal there. So you don't have those tools in place to you. And so putting those, you know, the sales control foundation in place is that much more important.
So as we wrap up today's discussion, a couple things to think about here. There are going to be business issues that you need to tackle in order to clean up your channel management. There are going to be legal issues that you need to address as you think through how to update your channel management strategy. As you think about the materials we've talked about today, if you've got legal questions, please approach Denise, and she and her firm can help you. If you've got business questions, by all means approach me or my firm at Buybox Experts. We'd certainly love to have a conversation with you. You're not going to be able to do a full comprehensive channel management effort until you address both the legal and the business issues, because at the end of the day, your general counsel can only do so much. You've got to get your sales team aligned. You've got to get your branding team aligned. You've got to get your marketing team aligned. There's lots of pieces here needed in order to fix this. And again, this is not a once and done situation. You've got to evolve the way you think about managing all of your channels. You've got to evolve the way you think about how you launch new products, how you do promotions. All of that's going to play into creating effective channel management that addresses a world that contains online marketplaces. So it's a hard job, but it certainly can be done. Time for one last question here. Do you have an opinion on giving Amazon a limited portion of your catalog to protect your retailer or brand's direct-to-consumer site? How do you think about splitting your catalog and potentially using Amazon for some of the products versus other products sold elsewhere? How would you think about that, Denise?
I think it's a great strategy. I think also an even better one is if you're able to create a very unique product, even if it is within that, that particular space, and you're trying to get that footprint to the consumers, creating something that is unique and different within the Amazon channel. So you could either apportion part of your catalog to Amazon, or you can create a distinctly different, product specifically for Amazon or vice versa. I'd say more for Amazon. That might be effective.
One of the things I've seen companies do, though, is putting specific products in the Amazon catalog does not stop the rest of your catalog from showing up anyways, because you don't have tight control of distribution.
That's true. That is true.
One must be careful that it's not about, let's put some selection so Amazon customers are happy. The selection you don't aggressively manage is still going to show up on Amazon. So Amazon's a great place to test out new selection and try things out, but you've still got to lock down control of all of your catalog, or at least anything that customers might be interested in buying. You've got to lock that down because somebody's going to make a buck moving it on to Amazon and seeing if they can sell it. So we are out of time at this point. I want to thank all of you for joining us. Thank you, Denise, for your expertise on today's call.
Thanks for having me.
We look forward to any questions that any of you on the call today have. Thank you again, and stay safe. Take care.
Great weekend.